Hi, um, this is another YouTube in my series, What's Wrong with the World and How to Fix It. And today I'm going to look at pathways out of capitalism. And the first one, like I'm going to do three in this, I think. And the first one's, I'm going to look at democratic socialism. So in these three videos, I'm not going to argue that case that capitalism is completely disastrous at the moment and that we need to replace it. I mean, I've done that in previous videos, and I'll return to some of those topics later on as well. But I'm more interested in these videos to look at the sort of what are some of the visions that people have as to how we might replace capitalism with something more benevolent, let's say. The three options that I'm looking at are the ones that I think are the most popular at the moment and the most, you know, if you boil it down, a lot of the other options that seem a little bit different are actually sort of variations on these three themes. Democratic socialism, radical reformism, and the gift economy. So I'll explain those, you know, in due course, but anyway. I want to explain these three pathways and also to give a critique and discuss them. And the perspective that I'm looking at is in relationship to system change. So there are aspects of these visions which, you know, may well make heaps of sense within the current capitalist system and representative democracy in the rich countries and so on, that aren't necessarily going to work in a post-capitalist utopia anyway. I'll probably come to some of those issues as I go along. Okay, so democratic socialism. Yeah, I find it hard to talk about this because, like, heaps of my friends in my book club, etc., are democratic socialists, or well, at least that's a label I'd give them. And like, yeah, before I go on any further, let me say that in terms of terminology, the term democratic socialist is used in the way I'm going to describe, you know, like taking over the means of production, nationalizing things, etc., planned economy, all that. Whereas the term social democrat, you know, you can just reverse the two words, right? Social democrat really refers to the sort of left wing of the Labor parties or something like that, a welfare state regulation of capitalism. Okay, so now I'm going to argue that, you know, as I've argued in previous videos, I don't really think the welfare state regulation of capitalism has got legs in the long term. But anyway, democratic socialism. The state takes ownership of the means of production on behalf of the people. Okay, the commanding heights of the economy are nationalized. In other words, you know, like things like energy, transport, education, obviously, health, and so on. Raw mineral resources like mining, even agriculture. I mean, it depends. I mean, different democratic socialists might define this boundary differently, but they all believe that the sort of central and most basic parts of the economy should be under public ownership. And when they talk about taking control of the means, of taking ownership of the means of production, the people take ownership of the means of production, they mean through a state. You know, in other words, that the state it nationalizes and owns these parts of the economy. So what are the other parts of the economy? Again, like this is a shifting boundary depending on who you're talking to. But anyway, in any case, the other parts of the economy could include small privately owned businesses, you know, like the local shop or whatever, or even more bigger than that. Market-based cooperatives of workers, industrial workers may be sort of supported and financed by the state, but nevertheless, workers' cooperatives, and voluntary community work. So democratic socialists might also envisage a large, well, at least some part of the economy to be made up of things like community gardens and so on. And access, so the basic form of access to goods and services is through either a wage, like you're either working for a state company or a private business and getting a wage, and then you go out and buy things, et cetera, or you get a state pension, like, so if you've got a disability and you can't work, or, you're old or whatever, you'll get a state pension. So what's democratic about it? Well, representative democracy, and people espousing this point of view at the present time insist on the necessity to have freedom of speech and freedom of association and so on, and the ability to field candidates in an open field without the danger of them being bumped off by oligarchs and so on. So representative democracy oversees a planned economy and regulates environmental outcomes. So what Parliament does, they get together and they work out how the economy is going to run and planning it. In other words, what are all these nationalised commanding heights of the economy are going to be doing? And in doing that, they also plan for environmental outcomes. We're not going to do anything that's environmentally damaging or whatever. Okay, so I'm going to look at the sort of economic and social problems of this idea of this kind of economy, which is sometimes called a command economy, in the sense that it's not the market that decides what goods and services are going to be provided, but Parliament exercising command over the whole economy. Managers of firms. Well, so this is one of the things that happens in an economy like this, and like this was a critique of the Eastern European economies when they were working a sort of Soviet version of this system, not the democratic socialism, but a state socialism. But anyway, one of the things that people have written about in that is that what happens in an economy like this is that the managers of these state organisations, these state-based firms, compete to get state funding because their own careers are tied to the success of their firm. Like if their firm does well in terms of the requirements of the state and is doing what the state wants and is being effective as a firm, then their personal career goes off. Like they do better, and so what they want to do is to get more funding from the state. So the way they achieve that is they promise big, right? They say, we can do this and this and this, and they may know in their hearts that actually their firm can't actually achieve all of that, but they promise big because then they'll get more money and from the state. And then the other thing that they do is they overstate the importance of their projects. Our project is really necessary. We really need to build this highway. We need to build this railway. We need to put in these electricity towers or whatever it may be. And again, like the point of this is to try and get funding for their projects. And in a sense, the state, like the people who are in the planning departments and so on and making these plans know that this sort of stuff's going on, and they kind of try and make allowances for it. But of course, that's just compounds the problem because, in other words, your firm asked for a certain amount of steel for what you're going to need to do this next year, and the bureaucrats back at the central office are going, oh no, they don't really need that much. They're just making a big claim, and they give you less next year, and suddenly you can't do what you've promised to do, and this leads to massive inefficiencies and economic problems. And also to corruption, because in a sense, people are incited to be corrupt because what they want to do is to create a firm that's going to do heaps and get lots of funding. And there's an emphasis on projects that guarantee promised results. So like, okay, so it's, look, it's hard to explain this, but say an intervention, looking after young people on drugs and so on, like, okay, you might ask for funding for that, but you would be uncertain of whether the outcomes, you might have a great plan and you've worked it out and all your therapists think this is really going to work, and you sort of apply for money for that, but you can't be sure that it's going to work, and the state can't. They'll go, well, this might work, but it might not. Whereas the company that comes in and says, we're going to make 10 tons of steel rails, you go, yep, that's right, that's the one we're going to fund. Okay, so this leads to a sort of overemphasis on basic industry that we saw in the Soviet economy and like, for example, in China at the moment, faced by the huge downturn of 2008, the Chinese economy responded by building vast numbers of apartment blocks. I mean, that's something that's really easy to do, and you can go, and the managers of the government firms that are doing that are going, look, I've built 25 new apartment blocks, and that's what I promised, and or actually I've exceeded. I was only promised 20, and now there's 25. But whether these are actually necessary or not is another matter, and so that leads to inefficiencies, and this leads to environmental problems. In other words, there's a lot of waste. People respond to this situation by hoarding. They can't be sure how much the state's going to give them, so they hoard a stock of resources that they may need if the things don't come through from the other parts of the economy that they're expecting or that they've asked for from the state. And now this is going to sound very neoliberal of me, but there's no effective market direction of large parts of the economy. And the effect of that is that you get white elephants that are designed to deal with political problems. And again, you can't help but point to the recent Chinese example of the huge, vast number of unnecessary apartment blocks that were put up after the 2008 crisis. This was a political problem for the Chinese government in the sense that they couldn't afford to have lots of industrial workers and tradies and sort of building construction workers out of work because of an economic downturn. So how do we solve that problem? Well, we just give them something to do. And what they give them to do is a white elephant. And this is a very common thing in economies that try to run in this way with a really large part of state ownership. They end up with lots of white elephants. And this also leads to environmental problems. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the market gets this any greatly better, but it leads to problems that are similar on the face of it to market problems. But they actually have a different social root or a different economic root. In the market case, people cut corners to get environmental, cut environmental corners to get more profits and so on. Well, this is not what's going on here, but the effect of these sort of white elephants is to create environmental problems. Social problems. Well, we're all aware of the way the party, the party that sort of created the revolution, that organized, the whole idea of democratic socialism is that there's the vanguard party which leads the masses to victory against the old capitalist state and takes control of the state. So the problem with that is that this leading party gets somewhat full of itself, and they start to take control. So that's representative democracy is rarely effective in reality. And within workplaces, the party operates as a sort of unelected mafia telling everybody what to do. I mean, in a way that makes sense, because what's happening at the level of the state is that the bureaucracy is being run by the party elite, and then the party elite has its sort of party representatives in each firm, and the state's telling each firm what they need to do to fill out the demands of the command economy and implement the plan that's being decided at the level of the state. And the unelected mafia of the party in the firm has all this power through these sort of connections. One of the things that these kind of economies can't solve, they run on money. Like, in other words, people get rewarded for doing the right thing by getting more money. If they're in a position of great responsibility, they get better money, and so on. So there's this hierarchy of pay which is very similar and resembles the hierarchy of pay within capitalist economies. And yet, at the same time, the ideology is all about, We, the people, have taken control of the means of production and we're running it for our own interests. And my feeling is that that leads to a vast amount of resentment against the upper middle class, that what Barbara and John Ehrenreich call the professional managerial class. You know, the engineers, the teachers, the sort of the lawyers, whatever. You know, even the media stars and people like that. These people cop a lot of resentment, and what can happen then is some sort of purge when the party decides that the PMC, you know, the professional managerial class, is getting too much control over things, and these experts are running things, and not the party, not the political representatives, and they encourage the resentment of the people who haven't managed to push into the PMC, or they're still trying to get into it and get privileges and get the respect that they feel that they deserve, and they push them into sort of some kind of vast purge. This is what's happened in Mao's China, you know, like with the Red Guards, the Cultural Revolution. And if you read the accounts of that, to me, it's really obvious that what's going on is that lots of people on the sort of lower middle class, if you like, and the working class, but especially the lower middle class, are massively angry with the privileges and the elite power of the professional managerial class. And this leads to these kind of vicious totalitarian kind of waves of disorganization and crap that go on. The command economy, the democratic socialist economy, depends on alienated labor. This is really hard for people to see, because they talk all the time about, you know, people who believe in this theory. They talk all the time about how, you know, the workers will take control of the means of production. How can you be alienated if you've got control of the means of production? Well, actually, in the sense of daily life, you don't actually have control of the means of production. Why? Because if you're in a nationalized firm, your firm is being instructed what to do by the government, and what price to sell your products and to whom, or you may be in a firm which distributes products to other parts of industry and so on. All of this is being decided from above, right? You don't have a creative control over that. And in a sense, what the government does is set you goals and deadlines and targets and things of that type, in order to fill the plan. And they need to do that, because otherwise the plan can't possibly work. And so you as an individual worker don't have a sense of control at all. You have the opposite sense of being under the gun, of being constantly told what to do, of doing meaningless stuff that you think is silly, of distributing your products in ways that you're not happy with, etc., etc. So it's no different. The alienated labor that capitalist societies experience, which is characteristic of capitalism, is maintained, right? And if you're working for a private company in the context of social democracy, democratic socialism, then if you're working for a private company, that's no different to capitalism. Your boss, or even if it's cooperative, the cooperative has to worry about what the market might want. And so on, and then not to mention filling all the directives coming from the state. In all of these cases, people don't have a sense of control. They're not actually meeting with other people voluntarily, deciding what to produce and deciding to whom these products are going to be distributed. That's not happening. What does that do? It leads to drives for increased consumption. You know, the whole joke about, you know, the Soviet Union fell because people wanted the jeans that were only made in America. I mean, that's a joke, but on the other hand, it's absolutely true that these societies totally depend upon, for their political stability, they depend upon constantly increasing the wealth and compensating people for the alienated labor they experience within the workplace. That has huge environmental consequences, because basically it means there's a constant drive to increase resource use and to increase affluence and so on. And we can see this operating in countries like China at the moment. You know, the last thing the Chinese government can afford is for the standard of living and, you know, affluence measured in consumer goods to fall in the upper middle class, the middle class and the working class. You know, that they can kind of grind down the lower working class and the ethnic minorities and so on, but they can't, there's a section of the population that supports them because they can see their standard of living going up. You end up with a wealthy elite of state managers because of the competition between industrial units to get state favour. I mean, in other words, these people who are in charge of managers of firms, in a way they're state employees, but what they become is a sort of unofficial elite who compete with each other to jockey for positions in the state bureaucracy and in terms of positions as managers of ever bigger and bigger firms and so on. And they become a wealthy elite. This also creates environmental problems. In other words, they signal their power by buying expensive cars and going for long trips in cars to holiday houses and using vast amounts of electric power and everything like that also happens in capitalism. And then if you try and deal with some of the inefficiencies of the state-owned nationalised planning, central planning system by introducing more and more market control and marketising everything, well, you just start to go back to capitalism, and like this is what we're seeing now. And of course, Russia went right back to capitalism, but I mean, the Chinese are trying to continue, and they're continually teetering on this knife edge. But what it means in terms of the environmental issues and the social justice issues is that most of the problems of capitalism get replicated eventually if you go down that path of increasing the domination of the market. People get rich, right? And the poor get poorer and poorer and so on. So to conclude this talk on this pathway out of capitalism, well, I suppose what I would be saying would be that I don't think socialism and money and the market are a good mix, and like this model, the democratic socialist model, uses money to implement political control, right? The government allocates money to fund the enterprises which they think are part of their central plan. In turn, these enterprises incentivize people in the community to work for a wage, knowing that without a wage, they don't get access to goods and services. So the whole system runs upon monetary controls of various kinds. And as I've said, this implies alienated labor. All right, if you've got money, if you need money to buy things, so now you've got money, I'm ready to buy something. What you're about to do is to take ownership of the product of someone else's alienated labor. In other words, they had to do a job that would earn them money and produce things that they could sell to you, so that there's a connection between your use of money and their alienated labor. And in terms of socialism, which is about taking control of the means of production, and the workers will own everything, it doesn't make any sense. There's a mismatch there. Money implies a discourse of buying cheap and selling dear. It implies winners and losers, competition. And that's what we see. That's what all this corruption, that there's a constant problem. And these, like party feuds and all of this sort of stuff is about. This competition is an inevitable part of a monetary economy because people, by owning money, you own a parcel, you privatize a parcel of the community's wealth. What also happens is that the market and the state are always in competition in the sense that by the parts of the economy that the state owns can't be owned by the market. The parts of the economy that the market owns can't be owned by the state. So what happens is that it's a seesaw, but both of these, the state loses if the market gets more of the share of the economy, and vice versa. So they're always in competition with each other. There's no resolution of these problems. They just go on and on. There's competition for wealth as money, because money implies ownership of private parcels of economic wealth, of the community's resources and wealth. And now this actually is the final slide. The political problems with this model. Okay, and these are, well, I mean, you know, like I hesitate to say this because these are sort of used in the most stupid anti-communist raves by people. But on the other hand, you know, they're not entirely inaccurate. Well, first of all, there's a terrible history, if you like, of attempts to impose, you know, attempts to create, let's say, attempts to create democratic socialism. I mean, you could say there was no attempt in Russia, you know, in the USSR to create democratic socialism. Or you could say that they were surrounded by, you know, capitalist powers who invaded them, and that's all true, you know, But it's like how many times do you try this experiment out and get the same results? You know, like in terms of Al-Anon and AA and so on, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing again and again and expecting different outcomes. And it's like, that's how I feel a bit about this. And I mean, I think that, yeah, so there's the USSR, China, God, what a nightmare. Vietnam, well, you know, Vietnam and Cuba, you know, like, yeah, maybe. They're certainly not disastrous compared with other developing countries. You know, like if you want to compare Cuba and parts of India, where would you rather be? And yet, of course, they're not a great success either. You know, there's huge resentment in the community. There's grumpiness. There's a lack of efficacy. There's people are working a lot harder than they need to at things that don't really make a lot of sense. And, you know, there's an elite which everybody resents. And you can hardly see them as a success of a classless society. That's how I feel about them. And then there's so many developing countries where this model has been tried and failed. And I suppose one of the things I'd be saying about those is that in very many cases, the people who wanted to do this, who got the, you know, gumption to get up there and make that anti-colonial struggle and that revolution and so on, were quite democratic. They wanted a democracy. They didn't want to rule an authoritarian disaster. But it didn't work. You know, so I'm looking at countries like Nicaragua. I mean, they won the revolution. They were in control of that country. The Americans sent in a few Contras, but really, is that what destroyed the Nicaraguan revolution? No. Venezuela, what a bloody nightmare. I mean, really, it's like, again, you know, they had control of that country. They owned the means of production. You know, the state owned the means of production. There was Chavez wanted democracy. He wanted to decentralize control to workers' cooperatives, but it didn't work. And my analysis is that it didn't work because this whole model is flawed. It's flawed because of the use of money in central planning and nationalization. None of that works. Zambia, Uganda, Tanzania, Angola, Mozambique, the Congo. Yeah, some of these countries were invaded by right-wing coups and, you know, the Americans funded right-wing rebellions against them and so on, but also they also failed. If we're looking at the rich countries, I'd have to say democratic socialism is a very unlikely choice for an angry population to move to. There's a total hostility to the nanny state in this community. I'll talk about why that is in a minute. But like, to give an example, okay, so I was interviewing some steel workers in Newcastle when there still was a steelworks in Newcastle. And this one guy, he said he told me two little narratives, which I found very telling. One was about the regulations, the environmental regulations against burning off. See, I was asking him about his environmental views. Burning off, in other words, you take rubbish into your backyard, a lawn in Australian context, we're looking at a quarter-acre block or whatever. You take your rubbish into the backyard and set light to it and burn it. Okay, a very traditional habit of Australians, part of our culture. Anyway, and he did this one day, and he goes, and these guys from the fire brigade came round and they came onto my land and they told me not to do this, And it's like an invasion of his private space. It's the nanny state taking over. He hates that. And you hear the same discourse spread out when, the greenies are stopping people from burning off. These farmers only just want to do the right thing and the greenies are stopping them. People hate this kind of regulation. And the other thing that he talked about was the rules on fishing. There was a possibility of new rules, which I think have now come in on commercial fishing in Lake Macquarie, which is this huge lake in eastern coast Australia. And he said, I like to fish, and I take my tinny, and my son and I go out fishing, and I'm a keen fisher. And yes, it's true that the fish stocks are down in Lake Macquarie because of the commercial fishing, but I don't think they should be regulated. Those guys are making a living, we shouldn't be coming in telling them what to do. So, I think this is throughout the community. I mean, the Trump election was a classic example of that, not to mention the attack on the Capitol and so on. There's a widespread feeling in the community that we've had enough control. Oh, don't tell us what to do. In a way, so I'm just saying that I don't think democratic socialism is a particularly likely choice. Now, why is this? I mean, to me, I just trace this back to the authoritarian control of the capitalist workplace, the authoritarian pedagogy of the education system, which humiliates most working class kids and sets up middle class teachers to tell them what to do. These things engender resentment. You go to work every day and a stupid boss is telling you what to do, You go to school, and the stupid teacher's telling you what to do. Okay, so what does this lead to? This leads to this resentment of authoritarian control, which is expressed, the state, in a way, the state regulation which is absolutely necessary to prevent capitalist rapaciousness. State regulation it becomes the scapegoat. And so again, like rolling out the same point, I don't really think that a popular revolution in the rich countries in the next 30 years is going to go for that option. Now, okay, this is the last caveat at the end of this, which is this. I've been explaining what I think of the economic problems of nationalisation and a command and planned economy and so on. This shouldn't be in no way interpreted as a condemnation of public ownership in the context of capitalism. In the context of current capitalist societies, like in the rich countries, let's say, public ownership is some sort of bulwark against the worst of capitalism. It's also essential to provide the goods and services that are not profitable for the capitalist class to create. In a sense, the capitalist class is shooting itself in the foot by privatising hospitals, privatising nursing homes, and so on and so forth. They're ruining the sort of social basis on which people are productive workers. They're just destroying it because of ideology, because they're stupid. But I mean, so I'm quite a strong supporter of public ownership. I'd like to see public ownership of transport and steel work in the context of a capitalist economy. Yeah, fine. Energy, absolutely. But if you're talking about moving to a post-capitalist economy, I just don't think the democratic socialist vision actually can work. That's my problem with it. So this leads to a complete kind of schizophrenic split where I'm concerned. Where on the one hand, I'm happy to vote for the Green Party, which is in favour of all sorts of state regulation, At the same time, I'm looking forward to a revolution that's going to make all of that completely irrelevant. Okay, thank you.